In this video, I want to talk about population growth. That is, what factors are influencing a population of any species to either increase or decrease. Population growth can be defined as the change in the size of the population over time. So it's a rate, it's something happening over time. And this population change is influenced by both biotic and abiotic factors. And so there's a number of things that will influence whether a particular population is increasing or decreasing. Starting with our abiotic factors, we can think about what sort of things can happen in the environment. What is the climate like? What water is available and has it changed? What sort of natural disasters might come along, such as a wildfire or a flood or volcanic activity? Then there are geographic boundaries that will affect how large a population can become. If it's a population in an area where the animals cannot really travel out of that area, they'll be restricted. That will keep a limit on the population. A goldfish kept in a very small aquarium tank will not grow as large as a goldfish that's kept in a pond, for example. And then there are the natural distribution patterns of any particular organism. Are they a clumped or a uniform or a random distribution? How is that going to impact how much population can be supported in any particular area? Thinking about biotic factors that influence the growth rate, we want to look at the reproductive rate, which is also called the birth rate, the death rate, and then how many particular individuals are moving into a population, are immigrating, or are emigrating from that population. Just a quick illustration of some of these abiotic factors. We've already talked about biomes in class, and you know that the temperature and the rainfall or the precipitation are the two factors that really determine what kind of species, what kind of organisms can live in any particular area. So a place that is both very cold and very dry, like the tundra, will have much less biodiversity than your tropical rainforest, which has the most biodiversity of any biome on Earth. And you can just see from the pictures, there's not much that's going to be able to grow in our producer world on the tundra as compared to our tropical rainforest. And then again, we mentioned natural disasters, such as this wildfire at Yosemite in 2013 would have decreased the populations that were there, at least temporarily, and it would have to experience some secondary ecological succession. Here's an example of a geographic boundary, Pelican Island in Florida, where animals have to be able to either swim to get on or off that island, or they're just stuck there. And then when it comes to individual organisms' distribution patterns, here we have the nest spacing. The Adelie penguin needs about a 1 meter square place for their nest, and so there would only be so many penguins that would be happy nesting in any particular area. So these are all abiotic factors that will have an impact on the population size. So let's look at those 4 biotic factors that I mentioned. We have our birth rate, which of course is the number of new individuals born into a population over a particular time period. And then death rate would be the number of individuals that would die over that particular time period. Immigration rate is new individuals entering a population, moving into a population area. And then emigration rate are those that are moving out. They're leaving the population, perhaps because of pressure of not having enough places to have their nest. If you're an Adelie penguin, those things would provide pressure to cause emigration of particular species. So asking, how does a population change? And my parentheses kind of got lost here when the slide translated, but we've got our things that happen on a positive side over here on the left. So all these, the births and the immigration will be increasing your population, and then the deaths and the emigration would be decreasing the numbers from the population. If we look at this particular population of sparrows, if we have 60 born and 12 moving in, we're having an increase of 72. And then if we have 40 die and 19 move out, we have a decrease of 59. So overall, if you have 72 coming in and 59 going out, we are seeing a population increase. It is a positive population growth rate. There will be more sparrows at the end of this time period than there were when we began. You also see birth rates and death rates put in a line graph, as we have here. This becomes a little trickier to interpret. You have to kind of look at how are these lines moving as comparison of each other. Like in this very first section, the first 2 years, they're pretty much moving in parallel. And so the birth, and if we discount immigration and emigration, just looking at birth and death, the population those first 2 years is probably remaining pretty stable. But then here around year 8, we're seeing our birth rate plummet. It's really going downhill, and the death rate going up. And so this tells you during this time period, the population would be decreasing because we're not getting many new individuals born, and there are quite a few individuals that are leaving the population through death. And then just moving on, this period right here, just after year 12, where we see an increase in the birth rate and a decrease in the death rate, then you're going to be having a growth of the population occurring at that point because more will be being born than would have died in that particular time period. Death rates are also affected by how many births typically survive. So survivorship curves are another way of showing how death rates typically occur in a population. And if you look at the survivorship curve for any particular organisms, you can see some relationships between the birth rates that are typical of that organism and the parental care that's provided for those young in that particular species. And those two things, birth rates and parental care patterns, tend to compensate for the survivorship curve so that the species is able to thrive. So our first type of organism, type 1 organisms, you have the parents actually produce relatively few offspring and give those offspring a lot of care. And this is pretty typical of large animals. Large mammals are ones where you have just, 1 or 2 individuals a year born. Say if you're thinking about a cow or I have small ruminants or my goats, they're not having very many babies on a regular basis, and they provide lots and lots of care. So you have a pretty stable curve. It doesn't show much death rate for many, many years. Typically the organisms don't really start dying off in any kind of large number until they have reached well into their adulthood, their adult years. The second type of pattern, type 2, is that it's sort of in the middle. You have moderate amount of offspring, more than in the type 1 parents, and you do have some parental care happening. And so you sort of have an even pattern of death occurring throughout life. And so this happens typically for birds and for many species that reproduce asexually. And then our last type, our type 3, and we've got a frog example here, is that we have many, many offspring, lots and lots and lots of eggs, but really little or no care. They kind of lay them and leave them. And so you see this in many of your invertebrates, the amphibians, and many of your species of fish, where they're just really as very little parental care, but we have so many eggs that just, by sheer numbers, a fair number do finally make it to adulthood. But you see this very rapid death rate in the young. Many of them don't make it. Another way to talk about population growth is to actually what kind of curve does it have if you plot it on a graph. And under ideal conditions, when there's nothing restricting the growth of any particular organism, the growth rate is exponential. And that means the population size doubles every generation. So you start off with 2, and at the end of that generation you have 4, and then you have 8, and then you have 16. And that will make a J-shaped curve if you plot it on a graph. 3 examples of species that you can see an exponential growth rate. The human population, I'm not quite sure how things are going to pan out whenever we get through this coronavirus crisis, but up until this point, the human population has pretty much been on a skyrocketing growth rate. As we can see, this is the graph that's provided is actually of the human population. And so you can see this kind of J shape here being formed by the curve. There's nothing slowing it down. Bacteria that cause foodborne illnesses also typically experience an exponential growth rate. Can't get that word out today. And so that is why you have limitations on food safety about how long something should stay out at room temperature, because the bacteria would be able to increase at such great levels they very quickly will fill up the food at a point that it could make you sick to eat it. And then an invasive species, a non-native species, be it plant or animal, that has no natural predators, will experience exponential growth because this is an ideal condition. There's nothing there to stop it. Nobody's eating it if it's a plant. Nobody's preying on it if it's an animal. In reality, though, most populations are limited by the carrying capacity of the ecosystem. So we have environmental factors that are going to impact your growth rate. The carrying capacity refers to the largest population that can be supported without causing harm to the ecosystem, so that it can indefinitely carry this particular size of a population. And so the curve that is formed is an S-shaped curve. It's kind of an S on its side here, but if you think about how an S is put together, you can kind of see that in the curve. In reality, if you tracked a particular population as it grew into the carrying capacity of its ecosystem, the curve would not be this smooth. It would look a little more exponential at the beginning, and then it would sort of level off here in the middle when those environmental factors start to kick in that are starting to limit the population growth. And at this other end, when it reaches the carrying capacity, it kind of goes a little bit above and a little bit below, so that it doesn't make a perfectly straight line, because you will have a little bit too many. We think with the predator-prey relationships that we've seen in previous lessons, where you have an increase in the prey, and so then the predator population increases, and then the prey population decreases because they all get eaten, and then the predators die off because they have nothing to eat. And so that similar thing happens here on this graph. You'll see just sort of a waviness around the carrying capacity. So these limiting factors, these things that will slow down growth and put some organism into this logistical growth curve instead of an exponential growth curve, can be classified as either density dependent or density independent. And the density here we're referring to is the density of the population. How many individuals are in a particular area? The density-dependent factors come into play. They become important as the population size increases. As more and more individuals take up space in that particular area, we see increases in competition, whether it be competition for food or competition for space in the habitat or competition for mates between competing males. We also will have predation increase. As there's more prey available, then the predators will be able to, go to town and eat as much as they want. And having a denser population increases the chance of disease spreading from individual to individual. The density independent factors are things that are not influenced by the population size. They can come upon a population regardless of whether it is large or small. And so these density independent factors include all of our natural disasters or unusual weather that really, doesn't matter whether you have a lot or just a few individuals in a population, they're all going to be affected. And of course, human activities are going to impact other organisms, and that would be another category of density-independent factors. All natural populations will eventually move from unlimited growth to limited growth because we have a closed system here. Ecosystems, are not able to just keep on adding resources from the outside. They're going to run out of resources. They're going to have to limit the populations of the species in that ecosystem at some point. But depending upon the situation, some organisms can experience, at least for a limited time, kind of this unlimited growth before the limiting factors do kick in. So in summary, population growth is talking about how fast a population changes in its size over time. And this population growth rate is going to be influenced both by abiotic and biotic factors in that ecosystem. Under ideal conditions, populations can grow exponentially. They can double in size every generation, and at least for a short period of time, all populations can experience this. But most populations do not live under ideal conditions, at least not long term. And so population growth will be controlled by the carrying capacity of the ecosystem. The carrying capacity then is limited by two types of limiting factors. The density-dependent limiting factors slow population growth as the population size nears the carrying capacity. So as populations get bigger, these density-dependent factors become more and more important. But you always can have density-independent factors that can impact a population growth, that they're coming really regardless of the population size because they're not connected to competition or predation or disease, which are the three biggies in so far as the density-dependent factors are concerned. So this gives you some background in how population growth will be affected by what's going on in the greater ecosystem. We'll be looking at some case studies in class and applying some of the things that you've learned in this video.